Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with this topic, genetic load, and the chapter is population genetics. So, genetic load, or the load itself, by its literal meaning, means a burden, and genetic load means a genetic burden. So, we are talking about some genes, a particular gene or group of genes that do not help in the survival of a particular individual, and if they persist in a particular population or a species, they will have lethal or deleterious consequences. So the presence of those genes which do not help in survival, they act as a burden, and such gene, the presence of which known as genetic load. Now let's look at the text. So Crow proposed the three definitions of genetic load, of which mostly used one is that the express genetic load is the fraction by which the average population fitness is decreased in comparison with the genotype showing the highest fitness. So here in this definition there are two parameters. The first is the standard one and the second the deviations. So let's say there is a gene X which is the standard one. Standard by here it means it has greater extent of survivability, or it has higher fitness. And when other gene Y is measured against this particular standard, and the deviation or the gap that is found between the standard and the deviation, if it is greater, then it is considered that the Y, this particular gene, is not fit enough, or it expresses reduced fitness. So this is the definition that has been generalized by Crow. In short, in other words, the same thing could be expressed in a different way. Um, Presence of gene, first of all, their basic purpose is survival of an individual, which ultimately leads to survival of a species. But if those genes are not good enough, if they reduce fitness, the presence of which reduce fitness of a particular individual, then those genes are not considered standard, and hence they are considered genetic load. Then, the next paragraph, it appears that some polymorphism exists because recurrent mutations replace gene loss to selection. And if you can recall what was discussed in the previous video, one of the previous video, in which I I said that there are two processes in nature, one that brings in uniformity, natural selection, and the other one that brings in diversity, that is mutation. So both the processes, they work in tandem, as it has been made clear in the previous videos that natural selection, by its very element of selection, it tries to weed out the unnecessary, or you can say less helpful gene by the mechanism of natural selection. So if this process, natural selection, if it is not stopped, if it is allowed to go for a long time, then ultimately it will bring in a uniform atmosphere or uniform conditions of life, which is not good for life. Life can carry only when there is a diversity. And even natural selection, the foremost criteria for natural selection to act is to have variations. Variability is the first condition upon which natural selection acts. But if the same factor, same process that needs variations as its fuel, as its sine qua non to exist, the same process, if they are weeding out the variations, then some variations needed to be integrated into the system. And such variations, they are brought in by mutations. So here in this paragraph, it is written that polymorphism, which means the presence of multiple form of morphs, which means in simple terms, multiple form of alleles. So one example of sickle cell anemia in which there is dominant heterozygous for spherical shape, and then there is another variation which is of sickle shape, and then the three variations, the homozygous dominant, the heterozygous dominant and the homozygous recessive, ये तीनों variations जो हैं, this one, ये है homozygous dominant, then this one homozygous recessive. So ये तीन variations, these are polymorphism, multiple variety of alleles. Here we know that the nature, it will select the dominant one. So here this case, the heterozygous and the homozygous dominant, both of which will be selected, and this one, as we have discussed, that the presence of both the allele in the sickle shape, it will lead to the death of individual by hemolysis or anemia. So this gene, this particular variety, this morph will ultimately be deleted from the system. And this is what is written here, that some polymorphism exists because recurrent mutations replace genes that are lost to selection. So mutations are there, but they are other polymorphism. They exist because the heterozygous is adaptively superior and causes several alleles to persist even though many are lost due to selection against both homozygotes. So यहाँ पे same condition, I represent spherical shape by S and sickle shape by A. So here in this case, I draw the notations again. Three variety of alleles. The homozygous dominant, the heterozygous dominant, and the homozygous recessive. And now we know that, abhi just samjhaya, that this one will be lost. So if this one is lost, so ultimately these two will remain in the system. But that is not likely, and that should not be the case, because again, diversity is the factor upon which natural selection acts. If all are uniform, then nothing is there to be selected, and uniformity is against the cultivation or propagation of life, because it's like a single boat on, you can say, against a giant wave. So if all the people are boarded on a single board, and the waves, they are coming in succession, all are giants and lethal waves, then if all the people aboard the same board, which means a uniform condition, then either they will die together or either they will live together. And this is quite a case, I can say a hypothetical case, but uniformity is likely to lead to such a case if it is not for mutations. So again, back to the paragraph. So some polymorphism, which means some mutation, some diversity, it exists first because recurrent mutations, they replace gene lost to selection. So in the same this way, in this case, this one will be lost. This individual and this trait will be lost from the system. But these mutations will keep recurring because the primary condition for the existence for this particular trait, that is the presence of plasmodium vector or malaria vector. So malaria vector तो अभी भी वही है, the condition, the presence of conditions that sustain um, the population of plasmodium vector such as tropical condition, वो भी वही है, geography भी वैसी ही है, rain, temperature, humidity, climate change, वो भी तो वही है. So प्लाज्मोडियम वेक्टर विल बी देयर, और प्राय प्लाज्मोडियम वेक्टर रहेगा या इसका कोई सब वेरिएंट रहेगा, दोनों कंडीशन में this mutation or this variation will arrive in the system one way or another. So these recurrent mutation will be there. So they will replace those genes that are lost due to selection. Then there are other polymorphism, which is the heterozygous advantage. This one. So ये सिस्टम में रहेंगे, जैसे आपको बताया कि हेट्रोसिस और हेट्रोजाइगस एडवांटेज, उसके कारण दो allele, one dominant and one recessive, they can stay, they can exist in pair as long as they do not result in deleterious condition, or they do not result in death of individual. So in both the cases, the polymorphism will exist. Then the loss of individual, often unseen individual, when we compare the individual uh, against the whole population. So most of the individuals, they are unseen. Most of the individuals that are lost are unseen. So those unseen individual, the loss of which is termed as genetic load of a species or a population. Then it is also obvious that every human population carries a burden of deleterious mutations, as this is a classic example. So such burden exists there. So if the genetic load refers to proportion by which fitness is reduced in the population due to operations of factors such as mutations. Yes, so it's another way of saying or explaining or defining what genetic load is. So all in all, its genetic load is the presence of those alleles which reduce fitness. Then the third paragraph, how to measure the genetic load. So it is measured as decreased average fitness. So let's say यही तीन kids हैं, three kids with three different genetic composition, and now we know that this particular individual will not survive. So on an average, this particular group, it has a reduced fitness by the presence of deleterious alleles. So this decreased fitness is a measure or by which genetic load is measured. And if you want to go specific, because all the cases do not result in death, there are some cases in which there are other consequences other than mortality, other than death, such as sterility, जो टर्नर वाला बताया था आपको, टर्नर syndrome or Edwards syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome. So all such chromosomal aberrations, let's say example of Turner syndrome. So this situation, 44 plus XO. In this situation, female or the individual is usually sterile. So they do not produce children or they are not fertile. In that case, their DNA, their genes will not be transmitted. So this is another way of removing the deleterious alleles. Then morbidity, which is there are many genetic diseases in which individuals suffer their whole life, and because of their suffering in terms of physical ailments. So such morbidity does not lead to you can say like a good life, a qualified life, and most of them they do not result in any survivable children. So ये तीनों manifestations हैं जिससे जो genetic load है उसके consequences they usually appear. Then the genetic load of a species may be partially hidden and partially manifested. So again the same thing, all the consequences, all the results, all the outcomes of genetic load, they do not specifically be expressed in death. Sometimes those uh, outcomes they are hidden and partially manifested. जैसे sterility देख लिया, morbidity देख लिया, and कुछ disease है जैसे like genetic disease हो गया, कंजेनिटल डिफॉर्मिटीज हो गया, बहुत सारे चिल्ड्रन होते हैं दे बोर्न विद डिफॉर्मिटीज। और ये भी देखा होगा लाइक इवन वीमेन व्हेन दे यूजुअली मैरी or usually have children after 35 years of age, their kids they are usually born with congenital deformities. So ये भी एक condition है कि अब जो kids हैं either they do not survive enough, and even if they survive, they do not find the required mates, and even if they find mates, they are usually sterile, infertile, or in certain conditions they themselves do not seek any child. Then the genetic load, it depends on several variables. First, the occurrence of mutations, how many of are there, the number of detrimental or deleterious mutations, the number of mutant recessive alleles, number of partial lethal mutant dominant alleles. So ये factors जो हैं यूपीएससी की पर्सपेक्टिव से आपको you should remember them. And as of the explanation, ये सारे आपको बता ही दिए हैं, बस I need to brush them up. The first, occurrence of mutation, it means the frequency of mutations in a particular population. So let's take example of an inbreeding population. जो पिछले वीडियो में देखा था consanguineous mating और inbreeding mating. अब इस पैटर्न में if the mates, if they are close blood relatives, first cousins, and then both of them they decided to have children after 35 years of age. अब इसमें दो conditions हैं, दोनों की वजह से it is not difficult to understand that they will have certain genetic issues with the childbirth. And both the situation, inbreeding which leads to homozygosis, यानी जो recessives हैं वो बढ़ते जाएंगे, then 35 years of age it itself leads to genetic diseases, and both of these they will bring in newer mutations. फिर अगर उनके साथ they have a history of, you can say, history of smoking or exposure to radiations, working in hazardous chemicals, exposure of which, even if they are living in an area in which groundwater is severely polluted and tedious of which finds the traces of many harmful chemicals and metals such as arsenic, बहुत सारे केसेस में जो म्यूटेशंस हैं वो एक साथ बढ़ते जाएंगे। और इस पर्टिकुलर केस में इनब्रीडिंग 35 प्लस, स्मोकिंग, रेडिएशन हैजार्ड्स, हैजार्डस केमिकल्स, प्रेजेंस ऑफ मेटल्स, ये सब तो एक साथ ही they will have they will bring in, they will result in a series of mutation, and it is unfortunate that they will not result in a healthy offspring. देन इसी के साथ बाकी भी आपको समझ में आ गया, जैसे नंबर ऑफ डेट्रीमेंटल और डिलीटेरियस म्यूटेशंस। इस कंडीशन में बहुत सारे म्यूटेशंस हैं, बहुत सारे लोकस पे होंगे। देन द नंबर ऑफ म्यूटेंट रिसेसिव एलील्स, वो भी आप उसमें देख सकते हैं, स्पेरिकल शेप एंड सिकल शेप में। इफ recessive alleles they have been mutated, then the presence of which will always result in death of a child. जैसे आप इनब्रीडिंग पॉपुलेशन में आप हैब्सबर्ग एम्पायर का देख सकते हैं। अगर आपने स्पेनिश हैब्सबर्ग एम्पायर का सुना हो तो दे यूजुअली kept the throne to themselves and they married their cousins. In that case उनके जो जीनोम है it was severely loaded by presence of multiple alleles or multiple mutations. In the same way, Egyptian की बात करें, especially the Egyptian royal families, they also bred among themselves. So वहाँ भी the number of deleterious alleles, mutations, and the number of recessive ये भी काफी increase हो गए. Now let's proceed on to genetic radiation hazard. So in every generation, numerous mutations of every possible degree of harmfulness will arise in human population. और उसके causes बहुत सारे हैं, है ना? Some of the causes may be traced to the ancestral line. कोई पुराना ही आपके ग्रेट ग्रैंडफादर, ग्रेट ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स से कोई कोई mutation है that has been, you know, that has been accompanied in the genome of your family, but because of presence of one dominant allele, it could not be expressed. But आपके केस में it suddenly it found one other recessive, and this heterozygous dominant it became homozygous recessive, and in that case it finally got expressed in a particular species in your generation. So mutations तो है ही हैं, and in every generation the carriers of some of these mutations. So the carriers of these mutations or these mutants, generally the person afflicted with hereditary disease, malformations, or constitutional weakness will die before they have children, or will remain unmarried, or will produce fewer children than they would have produced. So ये तीनों conditions हैं जो mostly देखी जाती है कि if there is a mutant, which means a person that carrying a deleterious allele, so either they will die before the age of marriage, or they do not marry, or even if they marry, they have fewer children, or it may be a case that they will have healthy surviving children, or the persistence of further such mutations or recessive allele in their offspring will result in the death of their child. So ये भी cases हैं जिसकी वजह से such delay, such load are removed. Then the burden of genetic ill health and abnormality in human population is very great, and this is more so because of genetic hazards of radiation, and especially in the present time when we are dealing with a lot of hazardous chemicals, hazardous substances and radioactive substances, such as जो जितने भी हम technological gadgets and devices use करते हैं, जितने भी infrastructure instruments हैं, जितने भी क्या बोल सकते हैं टेक लेड ग्रोथ है, so जितने भी मॉडर्न ग्रोथ पैरामीटर्स हैं उसमें मेटल्स का यूज होता है, मेटल्स एंड नॉन मेटल्स, और उसमें बहुत सारे रेडियो एक्टिव मटेरियल्स भी हैं. एंड as of now we do not know how much of this radioactive material is being leaked into the atmosphere, and how this that leakage is manifesting it in our you can say in our household, in our family, in our food, in our plate, in our water. So since this genetic hazard of radiation is also greater in the present times, then high energy radiation they cause two kinds of damage to living matter. The first one is physiological and genetic. Physiological damage it consists of radiation burns, radiation sickness, and death. Physiological means outer expression, physical expression. Then there will be another which is genetic hazard. So first, this physiological damage it happened when atom bomb was dropped on the twin city of Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki by Americans in 1945, and the same thing it happened during the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, during the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So जितने भी ये nuclear disasters हैं, such physiological damage were the on-site, the primary consequences of radiation damage. Then the genetic one, which can lead to other malignant growth, such as carcinoma or cancer. Genetic damage includes mutations that are induced in reproductive tissues and transmitted to the progeny. So इसका मतलब है same the radioactive substances they have another side that is genetic damage. First आपको malignant growth यानी carcinoma, cancer का तो बताया that they result in unstoppable, uncontrollable growth of cell division. So uncontrollable growth of cell division, it is known as cancer. So first ये हो सकता है. Then other जो है जो रेडियोएक्टिव सब्सटेंस की वजह से जो म्यूटेशंस हैं, आउटसाइड म्यूटेशन, they can be induced in the reproductive tissues, especially in the gametes, in your sperm and ova. And as you know, अगर कोई चीज gametes के अंदर कोई mutation gametes में है, then it will be transmitted to the progeny, your child. The genetic damage may inflict harm on the descendants of the exposed person, and यही चीज बहुत सारे जनरेशन तक भी चलती रहेगी. And this multi-generational damage, it has been reported in all the three disaster: the nuclear bomb disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, and the Fukushima disaster. It has such instances of you know birth of genetically exposed and malformed children has been reported. So this is it, and we will proceed to the next chapter, the next video. Thank you very much.